Hello and welcome to our time-traveling kitchen, where today we're taking a close look at 20 incredibly cheap breakfasts that helped countless families survive some of America's toughest years. In the face of mass unemployment and razor-thin budgets, ordinary folks turned scraps into hearty meals, proving just how powerful resourcefulness can be. From inventive new uses for day-old bread to thrifty ways of stretching a single egg, each dish tells a story of resilience and creativity that still resonates decades later. Grab a seat and get ready for a fascinating glimpse into how people ate and thrived during the Great Depression. Number 1. Cornmeal mush with molasses. During the 1930s, families across the United States struggled to maintain a nourishing breakfast without depleting their limited resources. Cornmeal mush became a staple due to its low cost, relatively long shelf life, and satisfying texture that kept individuals feeling full for hours. Households often sourced cornmeal in bulk at affordable prices, sometimes through local general stores or barter systems, and simmered it in water with a pinch of salt to form a thick porridge. Adding molasses or a spoonful of brown sugar brought mild sweetness and masked any bitterness in the cornmeal. Some people sprinkled a bit of bacon grease on top when they could afford it, but many simply enjoyed it as is, knowing it provided enough energy to get through a morning of labor-intensive work on farms or in factories. The practice dates back to colonial America, yet it intensified during the Great Depression, when even items like fresh eggs or real cream were out of reach for many. By the 1940s, families who continued to face economic stress still relied on this dish, finding that leftover mush could be cooled, sliced, and fried as a makeshift cornbread alternative. Baby boomers later heard stories from parents and grandparents about the careful rationing of cornmeal and the sweetness of a molasses drizzle being an unforgettable taste of survival. In modern times, some chefs have rediscovered cornmeal mush for its earthy, hearty flavor, occasionally finishing it with sophisticated toppings. But during the Depression, it was all about stretching the weekly grocery budget. This affordable porridge guaranteed that nobody had to leave the breakfast table hungry, reflecting both a cultural tradition and a testament to resilience. Number 2. Milk toast with sugar. Before the commercialization of boxed cereals reached its boom, milk toast provided a filling option that required only a few basic ingredients: stale bread, milk, and a sprinkle of sugar or cinnamon if available. Families who had access to a small dairy cow or inexpensive milk delivery service found that heating milk on the stovetop, then soaking the slightly toasted bread slices, created a soft, comforting meal. During the 1930s, budgets were so tight that throwing away stale bread was simply not an option. This dish ensured every crumb was utilized. Milk toast also became a go-to for older relatives or those who struggled with chewing harder foods. Some households rationed out the sugar carefully, spreading just a light dusting on top to transform this humble mixture into a sweet treat. In rural areas, people sometimes used goat's milk or evaporated milk purchased on sale. By the 1950s, baby boomers might still encounter a simplified version of this meal for breakfast, but by then, it carried connotations of the tough economic challenges their parents had endured. Analyzing hundreds of historical accounts, diaries, and cookbooks reveals that variations of milk toast existed across different regions, sometimes incorporating a pinch of salt, an extra pat of butter, or leftover sausage grease for added flavor. The basic formula remained the same: bread that might otherwise go to waste, warmed in a bath of milk until soft, and lightly sweetened to make a meager breakfast feel special and comforting. Number 3. Potato pancakes with onion. Potatoes were cheap, abundant in certain parts of the country, and easy to grow in small backyard gardens. Turning them into breakfast patties or pancakes allowed individuals to repurpose leftover mashed potatoes or even grated raw potatoes, blended with flour and a little diced onion. Frying these pancakes in lard or bacon drippings yielded crisp edges and a surprisingly satisfying taste. Many families in the 1930s learned to add an egg when they could spare one, but often they omitted eggs entirely, mixing just enough flour to bind the shredded potato mass together. The onion provided extra flavor at a time when spices could be prohibitively expensive, and it also helped mask any blandness. Some families served these pancakes with homemade applesauce if apples were in season, or occasionally with a dab of ketchup in areas where tomatoes were easier to come by. Oral histories from baby boomers confirm that parents and grandparents viewed potato pancakes as a comfort meal that ensured belly-filling sustenance without breaking the bank. When the Depression eventually receded, many kept the recipe as a tasty side dish, reflecting on how necessity birthed creativity in the kitchen. And while modern restaurants might offer gourmet versions loaded with herbs, cheeses, or exotic sauces, the Depression-era potato pancake was purely about survival, speed, and cost efficiency. Number 4. Day-old bread pudding for breakfast. While bread pudding is often associated with dessert nowadays, it frequently appeared as a morning meal during the Depression because it utilized every stale scrap. Families collected bread pieces throughout the week and soaked them in a mixture of milk, water, or both, sweetening the dish with a bit of brown sugar or molasses if available. Adding a pinch of cinnamon or nutmeg depended on whether the household had leftover spice in the cupboard. Because eggs were sometimes a luxury, the custard base might skip eggs entirely, though those who managed to keep chickens often cracked one or two into the mix. Children looked forward to a warm slice of bread pudding at breakfast, as it seemed decadent compared to plain porridge. Social media discussions and genealogical forums in the present day often uncover these old family recipes passed down through generations, reminding people how a budget-friendly dish transforms simple ingredients into a hearty start to the day. Even during the 1940s and into the 1950s, bread pudding lingered in certain households as a thrifty breakfast or weekend treat. The concept also spread among different cultural backgrounds, each adapting the recipe to suit local traditions and available ingredients, reflecting the resourcefulness that characterized America before modern convenience foods. Number 5. Oatmeal with bacon drippings. Basic oatmeal made from rolled oats or steel-cut oats offered an inexpensive and filling foundation for the day. During the Great Depression, many families substituted water for milk to stretch supplies, and if they were fortunate enough to have bacon on hand, they collected the drippings and drizzled a small amount on top of the finished oats. This salty infusion added flavor without needing expensive butter or cream. As the 1930s wore on, some who had access to a small plot of land might raise a few pigs, utilizing every part of the animal for various meals throughout the week. Bacon grease was not wasted. It was stored in a tin and employed to make many dishes, including this flavorful breakfast staple. Sometimes a pinch of salt or sugar was sprinkled to balance the savory taste. While baby boomers might recall more standard oatmeal with milk by the 1950s, stories from parents or grandparents about bacon-infused oatmeal painted a portrait of how small additions made a significant difference. Modern dietitians might grimace at the amount of saturated fat, but in that era, calories were critical for those performing manual labor. Multiple newspaper articles and extension service bulletins from that time highlight oatmeal's nutritional value, underscoring its role as a cost-effective solution for families stretching every dollar. Number 6. Grits with cracklings. In regions with a strong southern influence, grits became a quintessential breakfast during hard economic times. Much like cornmeal mush, grits were affordable, derived from ground corn, and provided a substantial feeling of fullness. Adding pork cracklings, which were the crispy remnants rendered from fat, turned a plain pot of grits into something more savory and substantial. People who kept hogs for personal use were keenly aware of the importance of preserving and repurposing every scrap, so cracklings were saved for various dishes, including breakfast. Historical newspapers from the 1930s in places like Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi recount how families would serve grits multiple times a week, alternating toppings or stirring in bits of cheese if they could afford it. When that was not possible, just cracklings or a dash of salt had to suffice. Surviving letters and diaries reveal how children often grew up on these simple bowls, later reminiscing about the comforting flavor during more prosperous decades. By the 1940s, new variations of grits-based breakfasts circulated, but the essence of cheap simplicity prevailed in many regions well into the post-war years, solidifying the dish as an enduring culinary symbol of Southern thrift. Number 7. Fried rice with scrambled eggs. While rice is sometimes linked to Asian cuisines, it was also a Depression-era staple in many American households, particularly in areas where it was more cost-effective than wheat-based products. Families who had leftover rice from dinner frequently repurposed it the next morning by frying it in a cast-iron skillet with onions or any vegetables they had on hand. If eggs were accessible through backyard chickens or modest store purchases, they scrambled them into the mixture for an extra protein boost. This method minimized waste and ensured the household could stretch a small amount of food across multiple meals. In bigger cities with diverse immigrant populations, fried rice took on additional flavors inspired by various cultural traditions, such as Italian families using leftover tomato sauce or Eastern European families mixing in bits of cabbage. By analyzing extensive Depression-era cookbooks and personal letters, one can see how widely fried rice with eggs appeared in menus outside traditional Asian enclaves. People recognized that combining 2 or 3 inexpensive ingredients yielded a hearty start to the day. While baby boomers might more strongly associate fried rice with Chinese takeout by the 1960s, the concept during the Depression was purely pragmatic, reflecting a global tradition of reusing leftovers. Number 8. Biscuits and water gravy. Biscuits themselves were relatively inexpensive, relying primarily on flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a bit of lard. What made them a Great Depression classic was pairing them with a water gravy, which replaced milk-based gravy when dairy was scarce or too costly. Cooks would brown some flour in whatever fat they could salvage, maybe bacon grease, lard, or even the drippings from fried salt pork, and then whisk in water to create a rudimentary sauce. A bit of salt and pepper might be added to taste. The result was not as creamy as a traditional white gravy, but it extended the meal significantly. By the 1930s, numerous households found that a few biscuits smothered in water, gravy, filled bellies without requiring expensive ingredients. This breakfast tradition lingered in certain parts of rural America well into the 1940s and 1950s, especially among larger families with many mouths to feed. Interviews with baby boomers reveal that water gravy was a frequent fallback when money was tight, although they admit it lacked the richness of true cream gravy. Nonetheless, it proved that with some basic pantry items and a bit of ingenuity, a humble but satisfying breakfast could emerge from even the most limited resources. Number 9. Boiled wheat berries with honey. When wheat was bought in bulk or grown locally, families sometimes ended up with whole wheat berries they could boil into a porridge-like consistency. If they had the funds, they would grind it into flour, but in desperate times, cooking the berries directly was a way to create a hearty breakfast. The texture could be chewy, so adding a drizzle of honey or molasses, if any sweetener was available, made it more palatable. In some cases, families added dried fruit gleaned from home preserves or small orchard harvests. This dish provided key nutrients, including fiber, at a time when fresh produce was not always abundant or affordable. Farmers in particular relied on this technique as they had direct access to wheat crops. Baby boomers recount how parents would talk about these big pots of boiled wheat that could last several days if rationed carefully. Sprinkling a little sugar or cinnamon on top was considered a treat. Examination of period agricultural bulletins reveals that extension agents often recommended this method for maximizing wheat's potential without requiring a home flour mill. While modern consumers typically rely on pre-processed breakfast cereals, the resourcefulness of boiling wheat berries laid the groundwork for a low-cost start to the day during some of America's toughest times. Number 10. Leftover vegetable hash with eggs. Vegetables that were slightly wilted or close to spoiling were never discarded if they could be revived in a morning hash. Families would chop up anything from carrots and potatoes to onions and bell peppers, whatever was in season or left over from dinner, frying them in a skillet with bacon grease, lard, or a small dab of oil turned them golden and crispy in spots. If an egg or two was available, it was scrambled into the hash or fried on top to add protein. This method provided a nutrient boost in a diet often lacking in fresh produce. Some newspapers from the 1930s highlight how resourceful cooks focused on cutting away only the inedible parts of vegetables, using every salvageable inch. In diaries from that era, families mention living near produce farms and gleaning bruised vegetables to keep costs down. The hash could also be stretched by mixing in leftover rice, breadcrumbs, or beans. Baby boomers might remember hearing about nothing goes to waste from older relatives who survived those lean years. Over time, leftover vegetable hash evolved into brunch staples in certain regions, but during the Depression, it was purely born of necessity. Number 11, coffee soup with breadcrumbs. For families who could not afford milk or cream, coffee soup emerged as a peculiar but practical breakfast solution. Brewed coffee, which might be diluted to stretch grounds over multiple days, served as the base. Leftover bread was crumbled into the liquid, absorbing the bitter brew and turning it into a quasi-soup that some people sweetened with a pinch of sugar. The caffeine provided an energy jolt for laborers who needed stamina to tackle physically demanding jobs. References to coffee soup appear in personal memoirs and oral histories from the 1930s, showing that while many found the dish unappealing, it was better than an empty stomach. Rural areas sometimes had more access to fresh milk, so coffee soup was more commonly noted in urban settings, where milk delivery was costly or sporadic. By the 1950s, baby boomers might have heard older generations mention coffee soup in passing, often with a shudder because it symbolized truly dire circumstances. Nonetheless, it reflects the creative lengths people would go to in order to avoid wasting a drop of coffee or a crumb of bread, ensuring a form of breakfast existed even when resources were sparse. Number 12, cornbread crumbled into buttermilk. While some families struggled even to afford buttermilk, those who churned their own butter or had partial access to a cow might end up with a surplus of tangy buttermilk. Cornbread, being cheaper than wheat bread in many regions, made frequent appearances at dinner. Any leftovers were quickly repurposed by crumbling them into a bowl of chilled buttermilk for breakfast. This technique required almost no additional ingredients beyond a sprinkle of salt or sugar, depending on personal preference. For farmers and rural households, it became a quick grab-and-go morning meal before heading to the fields. Historical diaries from the 1930s highlight that this dish was especially common in the South, where cornbread reigned supreme. Children often found it refreshing on hot days, and older relatives might have insisted it was the perfect fuel for a day of physical labor. Even as times improved into the 1940s, many carried on this practice out of habit or preference. Baby boomers who grew up in agricultural communities sometimes recall grandparents eating cornbread with buttermilk well into the post-war era. It was another testament to how families leveraged what they had on hand, combining leftover starches and a tangy dairy byproduct to ensure they started the day with a no-fuss, cost-effective meal. Number 13, rice pudding with raisins. Rice pudding provided a hint of sweetness that made mornings feel less grim. Made primarily from leftover rice, milk or water, and a small amount of sugar, it became more luxurious if raisins or other dried fruit were available. Families would simmer everything together until it thickened, occasionally adding an egg yolk if they could spare it. That bit of extra protein helped sustain energy levels, but even without eggs, the resulting pudding was filling. Cookbooks from the Depression era featured numerous variations, reflecting the availability of ingredients in different parts of the country. In areas where fresh milk was a challenge, evaporated milk or condensed milk sometimes replaced it, resulting in an even sweeter pudding. Analysis of personal letters confirms that raisins were often a treasured ingredient, carefully rationed to last through multiple meals. For many children, a bowl of warm rice pudding with a sprinkle of cinnamon provided a taste of hope in otherwise tough times. By the time baby boomers arrived, families might have shifted to more modern breakfasts, yet the nostalgic recollection of a simple dish that turned leftover rice into a treat lingered in memory. Number 14, Depression-era drop donuts. Unlike modern donuts that might require frying oil, yeast, and a range of toppings, Depression-era drop donuts were made from a minimal batter of flour, sugar, or another sweetener, and a liquid that could be milk or water. Sometimes a bit of baking powder was included for leavening. The batter was dropped into a small amount of hot fat in a skillet, creating irregularly shaped morsels that satisfied a craving for something sweet. Families who produced their own lard took advantage of it, reusing the frying oil multiple times. Historical newspaper clippings show references to these donuts as a way to uplift morale at breakfast when real bakery donuts were unaffordable. The shape and texture varied widely depending on the cook's skill, but the principle remained the same. Keep it simple, cheap, and a little sweet to brighten the day. Some families rolled the finished product in a sprinkling of sugar or powdered cinnamon if available, while others ate them plain. Baby boomers might remember hearing about how these quick donuts helped break the monotony of plain porridge or toast. They were not an everyday breakfast due to the cost of frying oil, but emerged occasionally as a special treat. Number 15, peanut butter griddle cakes. During the Great Depression, peanut butter became a crucial protein source when meat was scarce or expensive. To make an economical breakfast, families mixed a spoonful of peanut butter into a basic pancake batter comprised of flour, a little baking powder, and water or thin milk if accessible. The peanut butter added flavor and nutrition, making the cakes more filling than standard flapjacks. In some homes, sugar was replaced with a drizzle of molasses or a pinch of brown sugar if they had any in the cupboard. As the cakes cooked on a griddle, the peanut butter's aroma filled the kitchen, providing a small boost to morale. Researching old community cookbooks reveals that peanut butter griddle cakes varied from region to region, with some families adding mashed banana if they could get fruit cheaply. By the 1940s, this recipe sometimes popped up in rationing guides, capitalizing on the widespread availability of peanuts in certain states. Baby boomers grew up hearing tales about how these inventive pancakes helped their parents get by without access to bacon or sausage in the mornings. Today's health enthusiasts might appreciate the protein profile, but back then, it was merely a cheap, tasty way to keep hunger at bay. Number 16, onion and tomato scramble. Eggs, onions, and tomatoes offered an unlikely but practical trio when budgets were tight. If a family managed to maintain a small flock of hens, they might collect just enough eggs for breakfast. Meanwhile, onions and tomatoes were some of the most common and easily grown garden staples of the era. Sautéing diced onions in a bit of lard or leftover grease, then adding chopped tomatoes and whisked eggs created a hearty scramble that carried a burst of flavor. Families that lacked enough eggs sometimes bulked it out with stale bread cubes or leftover rice. Documented conversations from the Works Progress Administration highlight how frequently onion and tomato scramble appeared in rural households' meal rotations. People in certain regions also added peppers or hot sauce if they were growing them, leading to a mild predecessor of modern southwestern scrambles. Baby boomers recall their grandparents claiming it was the perfect breakfast to get them ready for a day of chores. This dish symbolized how gardens played a crucial role in sustaining families, ensuring they had at least some fresh produce, even as grocery store shelves might have been financially out of reach. Number 17, prune whip on toast. Prunes, though not the most glamorous fruit, were inexpensive and widely available in dried form during the Depression. Families rehydrated them by boiling or soaking overnight, then sometimes whipped them with sugar, or occasionally with a beaten egg, white if they wanted a lighter texture. The resulting sweet tart spread was slathered on toasted bread, turning an otherwise bland start to the day into something akin to jam. This technique arose from the necessity of making the most out of cheap, dried fruits that traveled well and had a long shelf life. Government bulletins and women's magazines from the 1930s occasionally offered recipes for prune-based spreads and desserts, promoting the fruit's nutritional content in times when vitamins were hard to come by. Children, who might have balked at the idea of prunes, found prune whip more palatable because of its sweet flavor and smoother texture. Even as the economy improved, prune whip lingered in some families' repertoires, passed down as a quirky yet thrifty tradition. Modern health data acknowledges prune's fiber content, but during the Depression, it was simply a sweet topping that broke the monotony of plain bread, reflecting the era's unending search for affordable variety. Number 18. Molasses porridge with wheat flour dumplings. Another creative meal that emerged from analyzing hundreds of historical resources involves cooking a pot of water with a bit of molasses, or treacle, and then dropping small dumplings made from flour, a pinch of salt, and just enough water to form a dough. These dumplings puffed up slightly as they cooked, absorbing the molasses-infused liquid. The result was a lightly sweet, sticky porridge that felt indulgent compared to plain gruel. Records from some rural areas suggest that this was particularly popular when a family's cornmeal supply ran low, and they shifted to wheat flour dumplings to stretch a meal. The sugar content was minimal, relying on molasses to add complexity. Any leftover dumplings might appear again at lunch or dinner, mashed into other dishes. Diaries from large families confirm that children enjoyed fishing out these dumpling bites, making breakfast feel a bit like a treasure hunt. While such a concoction might seem unusual to modern tastes, it testified to the lengths families would go to ensure a somewhat satisfying and energy-rich breakfast without overspending. Number 19. Eggless quick bread with jam. Eggs were often scarce or prioritized for sale or bartering, leading to the proliferation of eggless baking methods. One such method was a quick bread that combined flour, a small amount of fat, maybe lard or bacon grease, a leavening agent, and water or milk if available. The dough or batter was then baked or sometimes pan-fried if ovens were unreliable. The final product resembled a dense bread or biscuit. Topping it with homemade jam, which itself might be made from gleaned fruit, gave families a sense of a sweet, robust breakfast. By reviewing 1930s community cookbook collections, one finds countless variations of eggless, quick breads, each shaped by the local produce and resources. Sometimes the jam was replaced with apple butter if apples were abundant, or with a thin layer of peanut butter if jam was out of reach. Baby boomers might remember the tail end of these breads lingering in home kitchens. Though simple and unadorned by modern standards, the bread with jam formula allowed people to start their day with a hint of sweetness while maintaining the frugality demanded by circumstances. Number 20. Scrapple and fried apples. Scrapple, made from pork scraps and cornmeal, was particularly popular in the mid-Atlantic states, but found its way onto many Depression-era tables thanks to its affordability and ability to use up leftover bits of meat. While scrapple is commonly viewed as a savory dish, some households adapted it to breakfast by frying slices in a bit of lard until crispy. Pairing it with fried apples, sliced and cooked in butter or bacon grease, with a dusting of sugar, resulted in a sweet and savory combination that felt a bit more indulgent than plain porridge or toast. Oral histories from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and surrounding areas show that families were resourceful in obtaining pork remnants from local butchers or from raising their own hogs. Cornmeal was again a cheap binder, making scrapple an emblem of Depression thrift. By frying apples, people added nutrients from affordable or homegrown produce, especially in regions with apple orchards. Baby boomers might associate scrapple and fried apples with older relatives who stuck to tradition, finding comfort in the flavors of a challenging past. Post-Depression references occasionally appear in diner menus, but the popularity of scrapple declined in other parts of the country once the economy improved and fresher meats became more widely available. Nonetheless, its role in morning meals during the 1930s was significant, offering a hearty dish that helped folks push through the day.